Today I wanted to break down the worst first overall picks in NFL history. I got a new microphone, so it's time to rile some people up while making yet another NFL video. Press the like button if you're excited, and let's get into it. David Carr is one of the most tragic busts in NFL history, not because he lacked talent, but because he never had a chance to show it. When the Houston Texans made him the first overall pick in the 2002 NFL Draft, they were a brand new expansion team looking for a franchise quarterback to build around. What Carr got instead was 5 seasons of punishment behind one of the worst offensive lines in league history. In his rookie season, Carr was sacked 76 times, an NFL record that still stands. That's not just bad, it's catastrophic. The Texans didn't protect him at all. Watching Carr play felt more like watching a crash test dummy than a quarterback. He was constantly running for his life, hit from every direction, and had zero time to develop. And yet early on, he showed flashes. Carr had a strong arm, decent mobility, and leadership qualities that made him a good prospect coming out of Fresno State. But he was never able to build momentum. His internal clock was completely fried. After taking hundreds of sacks over his first few years, Carr started seeing ghosts in the pocket. Even when there was time, he didn't trust it. The hits had taken their toll, not just physically, but mentally. Carr's numbers in Houston were underwhelming. 59 starts, 65 touchdowns to 71 interceptions, and a passer rating in the low 70s. But the blame wasn't entirely his. He was playing on a team that had no business starting a rookie quarterback. The offensive line was atrocious, his weapons were limited, and the Texans were figuring things out on the fly. By 2006, it was clear the Carr experiment had failed. Houston let him go, choosing to rebuild without him. After that, Carr bounced around the league as a backup in Carolina, New York, and San Francisco. He even earned a Super Bowl ring as Eli Manning's backup on the Giants, but never got another real shot to start. To Carr's credit, he never blamed anyone publicly. He never quit. He kept working, stayed in shape, and eventually found a second career as an analyst. He handled being labeled a bust with class and professionalism, which is more than a lot of first-round flameouts can say. Technically, yes, David Carr is a bust. He didn't live up to the expectations that come with being the #1 overall pick. But the context matters. He didn't fail because he couldn't play. He failed because he was thrown into an impossible situation and beaten down before he had a chance to grow. In the end, David Carr's career is a cautionary tale. No matter how talented a quarterback is, if you don't protect him, it won't matter. He wasn't the worst player to go first overall, but he might be the most mishandled. Steve Emtman is one of the biggest what-ifs in NFL draft history, a dominant college force whose pro career was derailed almost as soon as it began. Taken first overall by the Indianapolis Colts in the 1992 NFL Draft, Emtman was supposed to be the next great defensive lineman, a game-wrecking presence who could anchor a defense for a decade. Instead, he played just 9 games as a rookie, tore up his knee, and never came close to reaching the potential that made him a top pick. At the University of Washington, Emtman was an absolute monster. He was the heart of a Huskies defense that went undefeated and won a national championship in 1991. He finished 4th in Heisman voting, an absurd achievement for a defensive tackle, and won the Lombardi Award and the Outland Trophy. Scouts raved about his power, explosiveness, and relentless motor. He was a can't-miss prospect. But the NFL is cruel, and it didn't take long for the injuries to In his rookie season with the Colts, Emtman flashed the brilliance that made him famous. He had a 90-yard pick six against the Dolphins that looked like something out of a Madden glitch. But just weeks later, his knee gave out, tearing his ACL and MCL, a brutal combo that would haunt him the rest of his career. He missed most of the next season, then tore his patellar tendon in 1994. That's 3 devastating leg injuries in 3 years. For a man whose game relied on explosiveness and lower body strength, it was a career death sentence. Emtman tried to push through, even switching teams and playing briefly with the Dolphins and Redskins, but the spark was gone. He finished his career with just 134 tackles and 8 sacks over 6 seasons. For a #1 overall pick, those are dismal numbers. He retired at 27, a broken down shell of the player who once terrorized college quarterbacks. Was Steve Emtman a bust? Technically, yes. He never became the superstar he was projected to be, but calling him a bust feels incomplete. Emtman wasn't lazy or unmotivated. He wasn't out of shape or overwhelmed by the NFL. He was just unlucky. His body betrayed him before he could ever prove he belonged. Unlike some high draft picks who flame out because of poor work ethic or lack of talent, Emtman's failure was purely medical. In another timeline, he stays healthy, dominates for the Colts, and ends up in the Hall of Fame. In this one, he's a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most can't-miss prospects are still just one injury away from irrelevance. Today, Emtman is mostly remembered by hardcore fans and draft historians, but anyone who saw him at Washington knows the truth. Steve Emtman wasn't a bad pick. He was a tragic one. Aundray Bruce is the forgotten ghost of NFL draft bus, the kind of player who looked like a superhero on paper but played more like a background character on Sundays. When the Atlanta Falcons selected him with the #1 overall pick in the 1988 NFL draft, they thought they were getting the next Lawrence Taylor. Instead, they got a career backup with the stat sheet of a role player and the impact of a spring breeze. Coming out of Auburn, Bruce was an absolute specimen, 6'5", 270 pounds, and could move like a tight end. He dominated in college, especially during his senior season, and had scouts drooling over his versatility. He could rush the passer, drop into coverage, and blow up running backs in the backfield. His measurables were off the charts. He looked like the prototype of the modern outside linebacker decades before that position became what it is today. But once Bruce got to the NFL, the dominance vanished. He started just 42 games in an 11-year career and never had more than 6 sacks in a season. For a top pick, that's unacceptable. He finished with just 32 career sacks, fewer than many mid-round guys who barely saw the field in college. He never made a Pro Bowl, never came close to All-Pro, and was moved around between linebacker and defensive end in a constant search for productivity that never really came. Part of the problem was that Bruce didn't have a defined role. The Falcons tried to make him into everything: edge rusher, coverage linebacker, do-it-all defender, but he never excelled at any of it. He was athletic, sure, but lacked the technique and instincts to become a real difference maker. And once he lost that top pick aura, he quietly faded into the background of every defense he played on. After Atlanta gave up on the experiment, he spent a few years with the Raiders as a rotational player, where he continued to underwhelm. What makes Bruce's story even more painful is the company he keeps in draft history. He remains the only linebacker ever taken #1 overall, and his failure essentially slammed the door shut on teams ever trying that again. In hindsight, the pick looks even worse when you consider who else was available. Tim Brown, Sterling Sharp, Michael Irvin, all Hall of Famers. The Falcons swung for a generational talent and ended up with a guy who never had more than 2.5 sacks in 6 of his 11 seasons. To his credit, Bruce stuck around. He played more than a decade in the league and never became a locker room problem or media circus. But he also never became anything close to what he was supposed to be. If David Carr was ruined by circumstance and Steve Emtman by injury, Aundray Bruce was simply overhyped. A gifted athlete who just couldn't translate to Sundays. In the long, grim history of draft busts, Bruce is often forgotten, but only because his career was so unremarkable. And for a #1 pick, that's the worst sin of all. Jeff Gerorge might be the most talented quarterback to ever flame out of the NFL. He had a golden arm, a prototypical build, and the kind of swagger you'd expect from a top draft pick. When the Indianapolis Colts selected him 1st overall in the 1990 NFL draft, they believed they were getting a franchise savior. What they got instead was a walking soap opera, an arm so strong it could throw a football through a brick wall, and an attitude so abrasive it could fracture a locker room by halftime. Let's start with the raw talent. Jeff Gerorge could spin it. He had one of the best arms the league had ever seen. He made deep outs look easy and could launch bombs off his back foot. In college, he transferred from Purdue to Illinois and lit it up, dazzling scouts with throws few others could make. But from the very start of his NFL career, it was clear that Jeff George's biggest enemy wasn't the defense, it was Jeff Gerorge. In Indianapolis, the problems came quickly. Gerorge threw 46 interceptions in just 4 seasons with the Colts and struggled with accuracy, consistency, and decision-making. Worse, he clashed with coaches, called out teammates, and reportedly showed little interest in accountability. The Colts gave him the keys to the franchise, but he drove it straight into a ditch of dysfunction. By 1994, they'd seen enough and dealt him to the Atlanta Falcons. In Atlanta, Gerorge had a brief resurgence, putting up some of his best numbers and leading the team to the playoffs in 1995. But it didn't take long for the old habits to return. He feuded publicly with head coach June Jones during a game in 1996, resulting in a sideline screaming match that effectively ended his tenure with the Falcons. The team suspended him and cut ties soon after. That moment, caught on live television, summed up George's career. Incredible talent, undone by an unwillingness to play nice. After that, Gerorge became the NFL's ultimate journeyman. He had short stints in Oakland, Minnesota, Washington, and even a brief camp appearance with the Seahawks. He'd show flashes like his 1999 season with the Vikings, where he threw 23 touchdowns in just 10 starts, but they never lasted. The reputation followed him everywhere. Difficult to coach, too headstrong, a guy who cared more about throwing lasers than winning games. Gerorge ended his 14-year NFL career with 154 touchdown passes, 113 interceptions, and over 27,000 yards. Solid numbers on the surface, but he only made the playoffs twice and never won more than 9 games in a season. For a #1 overall pick with his talent, that's underachievement at its finest. Jeff Gerorge wasn't a bust in the traditional sense. He lasted a long time and put up stats, but he was the poster boy for unrealized potential. He had Hall of Fame talent and a practice squad mindset. He could have been great, maybe even legendary, but instead, he leaves behind a legacy of finger pointing, coach killing, and one of the strongest arms to never matter when it counted. Dan Big Daddy Wilkinson was supposed to be the next great defensive force in the NFL. A 6'4", 315-pound wrecking ball out of Ohio State with freakish strength, elite speed for his size, and the kind of presence that made offensive lines sweat. When the Cincinnati Bengals took him #1 overall in the 1994 NFL Draft, they were convinced they were getting a once-in-a-generation talent. And while Wilkinson wasn't a total flameout, he never came close to living up to the hype that came with being the top pick in the draft. Coming out of college, Wilkinson was a monster. At Ohio State, he bulldozed through Big Ten offensive lines and was a consensus All-American. He ran a 4.72 40-yard dash at over 300 pounds, a number that should not be physically possible. Scouts saw him as the next Reggie White or Cortez Kennedy, a game-wrecking interior lineman who would anchor a defense for the next decade. Cincinnati, desperate for a defensive identity, pulled the trigger. But almost immediately, it became clear that Big Daddy was more big than dominant. Wilkinson wasn't a bust in the sense that he was awful. He played 13 years in the NFL and logged over 390 tackles and 54.5 career sacks. Those are respectable numbers, especially for a defensive tackle. But for a #1 overall pick, for a guy who was supposed to be the backbone of a defense, it just didn't measure up. He never made a Pro Bowl, never reached All-Pro status, and rarely took over games the way he did in college. He was solid, he was serviceable, but he was never feared. Part of the problem was effort. Wilkinson had all the physical tools, but coaches and analysts often questioned his motor. He could dominate in flashes, then disappear for entire games. Bengals fans watched year after year as their supposed defensive anchor looked like he was jogging through plays. He wasn't lazy per se, but he never seemed to unlock the kind of beast mode that made him so highly touted out of college. After 4 underwhelming years in Cincinnati, he was traded to the Washington Redskins, where he spent the majority of his career. He played next to another high draft pick, Dana Stubblefield, and for a time the duo looked like it might live up to the billing. But again, the production never matched the potential. Wilkinson bounced around after that, Detroit, Miami, but never found that extra gear. He was always a big name with middle-of-the-pack impact. In the end, Dan Wilkinson had a decent NFL career, but for a #1 overall pick, decent is a letdown. He wasn't a total bust like JaMarcus Russell or a tragedy like Steve Emtman, but he was the guy who should have been great and just wasn't. For a player nicknamed Big Daddy, his career was more like middle management. A guy with all the tools in the world, but no legacy to show for it. Courtney Brown was the kind of player NFL teams dream about when he dominated at Penn State, but what looked like the makings of a superstar became a cautionary tale of how the draft can go so wrong. Chosen #1 overall by the Cleveland Browns in 2000, Brown was a physical freak, 6'4", 259 pounds, and capable of a 4.5-second 40-yard dash. He was the ultimate prototypical edge rusher for the new millennium, but what seemed like a can't-miss pick quickly became one of the most regrettable selections in draft history. At Penn State, Brown wrecked opposing offenses. He finished his college career with 28 sacks, including 10.5 in his senior year, and was a consensus All-American. His combination of size, speed, and burst made scouts drool. Cleveland, desperate for a defensive identity under new expansion ownership — the Browns were technically a new franchise in 1999 after the original team moved to Baltimore — bet big on Brown as the cornerstone of a rebuilt defense. But almost immediately, the cracks began to show. Brown's rookie year was modest. 5 sacks and flashes of athleticism, but far from dominant. And as the seasons progressed, his production never rose to expectations. Injuries dogged him. Ankle sprains, shoulder issues, nagging ailments that turned into lost games and inconsistent practice time. What should have been a rise to dominance became a plateau of mediocrity. Brown's overall body of work with the Browns 2000 to 2003 came in at just 16 sacks over 4 seasons. To put that in perspective, many young edge rushers reached that number in a single strong year. He tried to miss fewer games in 2003, but tripped into a bizarre fumble return. His own fumble for a loss. Symbolic in hindsight of a career that failed to gain momentum. By the time Cleveland declined his 5th-year option, essentially cutting their losses, it was clear Brown wasn't delivering the game-changing impact of a top pick. Tim Couch's NFL career is the football version of being handed the keys to a Ferrari and then being told to drive it off a cliff. Taken number 1 overall by the Cleveland Browns in the 1999 NFL Draft, Couch was expected to lead the return of professional football to Cleveland after the franchise was resurrected from the ashes of the original Browns team that moved to Baltimore. Instead, he became a symbol of failure. 1 part bad luck, 1 part organizational dysfunction, and 1 part body battered beyond repair. But from the start, the Browns did everything wrong. Couch was thrown into the fire immediately, starting 7 games as a rookie behind an offensive line made of wet paper and duct tape. He was sacked 56 times in his first season alone. To his credit, he showed flashes of guts and talent, even leading the Browns to a few miraculous comebacks. But the punishment added up fast. Couch's biggest issue wasn't talent, it was survival. He never had time to develop in a stable environment. He was hit constantly, injured often, and spent most of his short career getting off the turf and into the medical tent. Shoulder issues plagued him, a broken leg, a bruised sternum, you name it, Couch suffered it. And every time he seemed to be making progress, another injury or organizational reset would knock him back down. So was Tim Couch a bust? Statistically, yes. He never lived up to the expectations of a number 1 pick. But like David Carr, Couch was more victim than villain. He had the tools, but was tossed into a disastrous situation with no help, no protection, and no real chance to succeed. He didn't fail the NFL failed him. Today, Couch is more appreciated than he was in his playing days. He's a respected analyst and has gained some sympathy from fans who now understand just how doomed he was from the start. In the pantheon of draft busts, Couch stands out, not for being awful, but for what might have been if he had landed somewhere, anywhere, other than Cleveland. Jana Carter is one of the most frustrating busts in NFL history. Not because he lacked talent, but because we never really got to see what he could do. Taken 1st overall by the Cincinnati Bengals in the 1995 NFL Draft, Carter was supposed to be the next great running back. A generational talent out of Penn State with size, speed, vision, and a highlight reel that looked like a video game. Instead, he became a what-if story defined by injuries, missed opportunity, and one of the worst cases of bad timing a number 1 pick has ever faced. Coming out of Penn State, Carter was a monster. In 1994, he rushed for over 1,500 yards and 23 touchdowns, capped off by a dominant performance in the Rose Bowl where he shredded Oregon for 156 yards on just 7 carries. He looked unstoppable. Scouts said he had it all: burst, power, patience, and the ability to catch out of the backfield. The Bengals traded up to get him at number 1, convinced he was the next Emmitt Smith, but fate had other plans. Carter's career derailed before it even started. On just his 3rd carry of his very first preseason game, he tore his ACL. That was it. His rookie season was over before he played a meaningful snap. And while ACL injuries today are often recoverable, in 1995 it was close to a death sentence for a running back. He was never the same again. Over the next several years, Carter was plagued by injuries, knees, shoulders, hamstrings, you name it. He could never stay healthy long enough to gain momentum. In 6 seasons, he played in just 59 games and started only 14 of them. He finished his career with 1,144 rushing yards for the Bengals. That's not just disappointing, that's catastrophic for a number 1 overall pick. Carter did have a few moments. He scored 15 rushing touchdowns in his time with the Bengals, and he later resurfaced with brief stints in Washington and New Orleans. But by that point, he was more of a goal line back than anything close to the explosive weapon he was supposed to be. The burst was gone, the magic was gone. All that was left was a big name and a long injury history. Sam Bradford is one of the most expensive and enigmatic busts in NFL history. A quarterback with a golden arm, a Heisman Trophy, and a bank account that looked like he cured cancer, but a career that never quite justified the hype or the price tag. Taken #1 overall by the St. Louis Rams in the 2010 NFL Draft, Bradford was supposed to be the answer to a franchise that hadn't had a real quarterback since Kurt Warner. Instead, he became the poster boy for unmet expectations, fragile durability, and the end of the pre-rookie wage scale era. Coming out of Oklahoma, Bradford was a surgeon on the field. In 2008, he threw for over 4,700 yards and 50 touchdowns, winning the Heisman and leading the Sooners to the national title game. He was accurate, calm in the pocket, and made every throw look easy. But a shoulder injury in 2009 raised red flags. The Rams ignored them, betting big that he'd recover, and they backed that bet with a then-record $78 million contract, $50 million of it guaranteed. That's right, before Bradford took a single NFL snap, he was already one of the highest paid players in league history. His rookie season in 2010 was fine. He threw for over 3,500 yards and 18 touchdowns, won Offensive Rookie of the Year, and got the Rams to within one win of a playoff berth. There was promise, but that promise never materialized. The next few seasons were a mess. Bad offensive lines, limited weapons, coaching changes, and then the injuries started piling up. Bradford tore his ACL not once, but twice in back-to-back seasons, 2013 and 2014, missing 25 straight games and putting his long-term health in question. He returned to the field with the Eagles in 2015 after a trade, then was dealt again to the Vikings in 2016 after Teddy Bridgewater's catastrophic injury. To his credit, Bradford had a bizarrely accurate season in Minnesota, setting an NFL record for completion percentage in 2016, 71.6, but even that felt like an illusion. He was dinking and dunking, throwing short passes with little impact and rarely pushing the ball downfield. By 2017, the injuries returned. He played just 2 games and was replaced by Case Keenum, who took the Vikings to the NFC Championship. Bradford made one last stop in Arizona in 2018 where he was so ineffective that the Cardinals benched him after just 3 games in favor of rookie Josh Rosen. That was the end of the line. Bradford finished his career with 103 touchdowns, 61 interceptions, and just 1 winning season as a full-time starter. He made $130 million in career earnings, more than Aaron Rodgers made in the same time span, and never won a playoff game, never made a Pro Bowl, never truly elevated a franchise. JaMarcus Russell is the gold standard of NFL draft busts. When the Oakland Raiders selected him #1 overall in the 2007 NFL Draft, they thought they were getting the future of the franchise, a quarterback with a rocket arm, a massive frame, and the swagger of a superstar. Instead, they got 3 years of chaos, conditioning issues, and a legacy so infamous that his name alone has become shorthand for failure. Coming out of LSU, Russell looked like the total package. He was 6'6", 260 pounds, and had one of the strongest arms scouts had ever seen. He could launch 70-yard bombs flat-footed and made it look effortless. His Sugar Bowl performance against Notre Dame, where he threw for 332 yards and 3 touchdowns, cemented his status as a top prospect. Al Davis, the Raiders' legendary owner who loved big arms and flashy players, was obsessed. Oakland made him the top pick and handed him a $61 million contract with $32 million guaranteed. That would be the last thing that went. In 2008, his first full season as a starter, Russell threw 13 touchdowns and 8 interceptions, going 5-10 as a starter. The numbers weren't terrible, but the warning signs were flashing. He struggled with accuracy, mechanics, and reading defenses. He also showed up to training camp overweight and had a reputation for poor work ethic. Coaches complained he didn't study film. There's even a now infamous story that the Raiders once gave him blank DVDs labeled game film to see if he would watch them. He returned the next day and said, "Yeah, I watched it. It looked good." By 2009, it was clear this wasn't working. Russell regressed badly. 3 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, a 50% completion rate, and a passer rating so low it should have been illegal. He was benched in favor of journeyman Bruce Gradkowski and third-stringer Charlie Fry. In a league full of cutthroat competition, Russell wasn't even trying. He showed up to practices overweight, uninterested, and unprepared. The Raiders finally cut him in 2010, just 3 years after drafting him. He never played another down in the NFL. He made more than $39 million for 25 starts, 18 touchdown passes, and a lifetime quarterback rating of 65.2. He later attempted multiple comebacks, even offering to play for free, but no one was interested. The league had moved on, and his reputation was burned into stone. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to press the like button and subscribe. Also consider checking out our last video about the greatest undrafted quarterbacks of all time. Thank you for watching.